As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So according to AFP, Ukraine's ambassador to Australia said that Kiev has asked Canberra about the conditions of the 41 FA-18 jets that are stored in an airbase north of Sydney. So they put the request in, and last week, the Australian Financial Review reported that discussions were underway between Australia, Ukraine, and the US on sending the 41 jets to Kiev. So Russia, of course, has strongly warned the U.S. and its allies against providing the F-16s as well as other Western-made aircraft. But the Biden administration, as we've covered a lot lately, the Biden administration is not as concerned about escalating the war as it was earlier on in the conflict and have just totally brushed off Russia's warnings. They just don't seem to care anymore what Russia thinks, when earlier in the war they were concerned about what Russia would perceive as too much support for Ukraine. And fighter jets was something that they previously ruled out. But of course, now, they're going to be sending them over there. So Axios reported Tuesday that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the Israeli Knesset's Foreign Relations Committee that the U.S. and Iran have been holding indirect talks on a mini agreement related to Iran's nuclear program. Netanyahu said that the understanding being discussed between the U.S. and Iran would involve Tehran agreeing not to enrich uranium beyond 60% in exchange for access to frozen Iranian funds. The two sides are also discussing a prisoner swap that would be part of the deal. According to Axios, Netanyahu said that if he believed an agreement was close, he would stress his objection to it. And so a spike in demand for weapons from Europe and the Abraham Accord made 2022 a banner year for the Israeli arms industry. Tel Aviv's weapons exports reached a record $12.5 billion last year. In response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO members have increased their defense spending. The alliance's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has been pushing countries to increase their military expenditures to 2% of their GDP. I think he's still struggling to get them all to do that. So Germany and Israel, they just recently inked a contract worth over $3.5 billion for the Arrow 3 anti-missile system because of the war in Ukraine. A diplomat speaking with Haaretz said that if it was not for the war in Ukraine, this deal would not have happened.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Joe Biden's done the same thing. George W. did the same thing. Barack Obama did it all the time. Barack Obama actually used drones on Americans.
That's right.
And claimed he had the authority to do it. These guys, I wrote a piece, you and I talked about it about a year ago, called Why Do Presidents Kill? The short answer is because they can get away with it.
Oh, it's because they're mentally deranged and evil. I mean, anybody that kills, whether you're a president or you're a member of the Bloods and the Crips, I mean, what's the difference? Correct. Oh, I'm a president. I could kill anybody I want, and it's just fine. I'm doing it under the law. I will. Right. You talked about Barack Obama, the Nobel Peace of Crap Prize winner. That's quoted in the book Double Down. Quote, I'm really good at killing people?
Yes. That's outrageous, repellent, repulsive, immoral, unconstitutional, and unlawful. When I was at Fox at the time, and we went crazy trying to get the legal authority that Eric Holder, his then attorney general, relied on for him to kill these Americans. The guy's name was Anwar al-Awlaki. He actually was a friend of Donald Rumsfeld, whom Rumsfeld brought to the Pentagon to explain the Middle Eastern mentality to all senior Pentagon generals. He was born in New Mexico. His kid was born in Virginia. He and the kid was 16. The kid's male buddies, so about 4 or 5 of them, were seated in an outdoor cafe in Yemen, and an American drone obliterates all of them.
Yeah.
Suddenly, in the NBC newsroom, and nobody knows where this came from or how they got it, is a copy, NBC newsroom, is a copy of a memo from Eric Holder to Barack Obama explaining the legal authority for killing these Americans. So I called up a buddy at NBC. We had it in a heartbeat. I read it. I went on air and I said, this is absurd. They are likening the president of the United States murdering Americans who are peacefully sitting at a cafe drinking a cup of tea to cops shooting back at bank robbers when they're in a cops and robbers chase and they're each shooting at each other. And as the cops had the authority to shoot at the bank robbers who were shooting at them, Obama had the authority to kill these Americans. It made no sense whatsoever. A first-year law student submitting a document like that would have flunked the course.
You mentioned that Eric Holder. What an arrogant guy he is. He has a track record that shows you what a disgusting human beings are running this country.
Equipment.
You know, and speaking of what's going on in Ukraine, last week was $2 billion more. This week, another $350 million more. Oh, you know, you're down there not far, I guess, from that I-95 in Pennsylvania, that the truck blew up, right? And when it caught fire, they say it's going to take a couple of months to fix. If this was China, the damn thing would be fixed in a week.
Correct.
And you go everywhere around a rotted infrastructure near you, as we're spending billions of dollars to send over to Ukraine to fight a war that's none of our business. They just passed that debt ceiling thing, almost $1 trillion to the defense budget, as this country's rotting in front of us.
That deal that they passed, which would not have passed without Republican support, the Republicans stand for nothing today, allows Janet Yellen to borrow all the money she wants. Now, she needs $4 trillion. She can go borrow $10 trillion. You know what that's going to do to interest rates? If she goes out into the market and tries to get $10 trillion, she already is trying to borrow $1 trillion before Christmas, and that's pushing interest rates up.
If you want to know who America's next enemy is, look at who we're funding right now. Every single one of these problems are a result of government being way too big.
We're playing a new game here, and now that we've changed the rules of the game, I don't see how Donald Trump gets into office and doesn't go after all of them, and how they allow him to possibly get back in. And with all that said, to me, you know, I don't even know how they fuck up so badly where they make you root for Donald Trump. Donald Trump's like one of the luckiest, most privileged people that's ever existed. He's just this asshole of a human being, of a character who just seems to fail his way to the top, lives an incredible life, and somehow the deep state gets him on such a nitpicky nonsense thing that you get me rooting for Donald Trump. And I can't be the only one that feels that way. I bet there's a lot of people looking at this and going, oh wow, you know, when Donald Trump was screaming that the system wasn't fair to him, I thought that was nonsense. The January 6th thing was nonsense. But this we're all seeing it. We're all seeing it. This is Banana Republic shit right here.
The Peter Schiff Show.
They don't want to spook the markets, because if I'm right, and this is the end of the hiking cycle, they don't want to let the markets know that. Because if inflation is still a problem, why would the Fed not be hiking rates? I think it's because they're worried about what they perceive as a bigger problem in the economy. First, in the financial sector, in the banks, in commercial real estate, which also, of course, involves the banks. But Powell understands, to a degree, the problem that the banks are having with 5% interest rates. Why make that problem worse by going to 5.25 or 5.5? To me, it's like the mid-course correction that the Fed had when they, cut rates in 2019 and claimed it was just a course correction, that they were going to keep on hiking, that the hiking bias hadn't ended. They were just doing a little correction. They were just going to take, maybe 1 or 2 steps backwards before several more steps forward, so that we were going to continue to hike. We just cut a little bit. That was BS. I was right to call out the Fed. It wasn't a course correction. It was a change of course. It was a 180-degree about face, because the Fed never stopped cutting until it went to zero. And so I think this is not really a pause or a skip. I think it's the end. I think if the Fed really was going to keep hiking rates, there was no reason to skip the June meeting. And in fact, one of the things that Powell claimed the Fed needs to see in order for the economy to have the conditions that would allow inflation to go back down to 2%, he said what he needs to see is some softening in the labor market, or more softening, and slower economic growth. He believes that those are the necessary ingredients to lower inflation, which is a Keynesian philosophy that inflation is a byproduct of economic growth and employment, when it's not. None of those things actually contribute to inflation. In fact, if you are creating inflation, which is what the Fed is doing in concert with the government, running these massive deficits that the Fed has monetized, what you need is a vibrant economy, a productive economy with people working to help increase supply so that that will offset the increased quantity of money. So you want goods to go up so that there's actually goods to buy with all the money that the government is creating, that the Fed is printing. So a weak economy with lots of people not working and not being productive actually exacerbates the upward pressure on prices that are coming from the increase in the money supply, the inflation that is being created by the Fed.
No one yet in these capitals in the Western world and in Washington have not been brought up on charges of murder. Because if you look at the losses that are being taken today in Ukraine, it's inconceivable to me. I mean, from the moment that you cross the start line that you have no chance of success. There's a certain amount of bravery here and courage, I believe that, but I also know there are a lot of people being forced to do this. But the whole thing is just murder at this stage. The Ukrainians are going to push the Russians out of Ukraine where they are. It's not going to happen. But we refuse to accept that. Washington doesn't want to admit it's failed. It doesn't want to admit it was wrong. And the danger is, if nothing else works, you widen the war. And that's what we have to look for now from Washington.
We want to start off by an interesting topic today because we've reported on a special candidate. He's special to us because he's a friend, and he doesn't call himself a libertarian, but he doesn't know it. He's leaning strongly toward libertarianism and away from the two parties, and that happens to be somebody that questions the lockdowns and the pharmaceuticals and interventionist foreign policy. So he's very much on our side on many issues. That's RFK, Robert Kennedy, and he's somebody that we visited with. He's been on this program, and he's been to our seminars. So now it turns out, and I don't think he's fudged this, they were measuring favorability. And I was saying, if you just looked at that, I could understand why somebody would feel comfortable. Favorability is sort of like, who would you be most comfortable with? Do you think that people are going to be comfortable in the next 4 years, if there's another next 4 years of Biden? Or does anybody ever feel real comfortable with Trump? But that's one thing is, favorability or comfort, I think, Robert Kennedy sort of fits that. But he rated the highest of Republicans and Democrats. That's so interesting to know. They ought to take notice of that. The one a bit of surprise, but not totally so. Vivek Ramaswamy is on the air a lot. Fox, I think, is giving him credibility, and some others. But he rated it at 26%. For somebody just out of the blue, I think that is interesting. But if you listen to him, he's a smart person. He has some good ideas. But you know what? He impresses you because he believes in something. And he works hard at trying to be consistent. He has some libertarian views. But I thought this was pretty amazing at this point that he's ready. So I predict that he's probably going to do pretty well in the primaries when you exclude the leader.
No, he's no dummy, and he makes some good points. And as you say, he gets a lot of airtime. And I think on the Democrat side, they're trying to give RFK Jr. the least amount of airtime. They don't want anyone standing next to Biden. Let's go to this next clip. This is a little bit more from that same article. The results come as Kennedy, the nephew of former President Kennedy and the son of former Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, is sparking some concerns among Democrats who are feeding into the notion that they're worried about the primary challenger to Biden. Biden could lose first two 2024 contests to RFK Jr. Now, when you first look at this, you could think, wow, in a straight vote, he's going to lose to RFK Jr. And while that's possible, certainly, part of it is what you alluded to, Dr. Paul, which is there's a lot of shenanigans going on. If you could put that next one on, about where the first state will be. It's always traditionally been New Hampshire and Iowa. That's been how it's always been. But Biden doesn't want to do that anymore. His excuse, Dr. Paul, is that those states are just too darn white. They need some more diversity. Whereas some people that might be a little bit more savvy or perhaps cynical would say, He hasn't done very well in those states, and he may actually lose them. But as you were saying, he may just simply not compete. If Iowa and New Hampshire say we're going to hold our primaries anyway, he may take his name off the ballot and thus lose by default.
You know, when they talk about diversity, I'm all for it, because I think the most diversity comes from libertarianism.
Yeah.
Because you go down to the individual rather than a contest between the special interests. But this primary sort of reminds me of what was going on in '68 over a war issue, and Johnson was president, and it didn't do well in the primary up there. I don't think it's going to happen to Biden. It might be a little bit late, but maybe not. You know, but Johnson, and I remember this so clearly because I had the TV on and the listening because the primary was ending. But I remember the announcement so clearly when Johnson decided, I've decided not to run.
Yeah.
When it was Eugene McCarthy,
yeah.
you know, did well, and so who knows what'll come of this? So
losing those first two have driven the decision to not have a debate on the Democrat side. And obviously, when you are the incumbent, you're not super keen on stepping up on the stage and possibly getting beaten up. So that's understandable. But interestingly enough, if you can put on that next clip, the Democrats aren't happy about this. The voters aren't happy about this. 80% of Democrats think Biden should debate RFK Jr., including 72% of those who support the president, even though he's insisted he won't face primary rivals. And this is from the Daily Mail just a couple of days ago. They took a poll that says a vast majority, 8 in 10 Democrats, think that Biden should take on RFK in a debate. I don't think that's going to happen, Dr. Paul. I don't know how you feel.
Well, I do, because you know, things are bad. Freedom of speech, the First Amendment, it's a mess, and both sides are complaining about it. But it's not that bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it is still. He can't hide. He can run, but he's not going to be able to hide. So we'll see what happens.
Washington's never-ending love affair with sanctions, and he points out how sanctions have been ineffective, and I think you've got a couple of comments on the piece.
Yes, and I've been talking about sanctions for a long time because I think they backfire. I think they hurt the little people and the average person. It destroys free trade. It's usually, people think it could lead to war. No, I say it is war. If anybody would put sanctions, they're like blockades, and if they're going to interfere with our imports, we would be furious. And yeah, we're in the driver's seat. And to be in the driver's seat, it works better when you have control of the world's biggest military, and you have control of the reserve currency of the world. Then sanctions are possible. But then also for them to do it, that country that throws their weight around and does it, they have to have a lot of say in the international organization. And because we're the big financiers of that, we do have something to say. And this is why we do have this to say. And this is why I think it breeds a bad feeling between nations. And yet it's nothing new what we're saying, because it's been it's old history, economic history, that free trade is very, very beneficial. I mean, hundreds of years or more that trade always is a natural thing. Trade is a natural thing. When people are left alone and governments are minimal, people trade, you know, even under the worst of circumstances. So that to me is bad. But I think, and I think Ted does a good effort in his closing paragraph. He summarizes how it backfires on people, how it's not a good policy, and we shouldn't engage in it.
It's almost become a joke in a way, Dr. Paul, that sanctions, so many rounds of sanctions on Russia haven't brought it to its knees. And in fact, if we can have a little bit of a humor break, the folks over at RT made a pretty funny video. Now, they use deep fakes and AI. These aren't the real people, but they use that to kind of troll the idea that sanctions are so great. And the whole, well, you'll see the joke if we play this. It's just a funny 1-minute clip.
No, that's bull. That's nonsense. We need some fresh ideas. Better, stronger, and effective. Oh God, I'm so tired.
The International.
So that's making the rounds. That's that's going viral on Twitter and stuff. It's just a funny way to know the fact that they're just desperate to find sanctions that they don't work.
Right.
Interesting, this is kind of a follow-up to what we talked about yesterday. We talked about Adam Schiff. We know he lied for years and years when he said, hey, I'm the chairman of the Intel Committee and I know lots of stuff about Trump and Putin. I can't tell you, but wink, wink, it's a really bad stuff. Turns out he was just blowing smoke. So now the House, which is controlled by the GOP, as we mentioned yesterday, wants to pass a motion of censure, and they did, in fact, put up a motion of censure against him. If we go to the next one. So the big controversy is that Thomas Massie said he's going to vote against it, and it infuriated a lot of people who were furious with Adam Schiff. And of course, we are not big fans of Adam Schiff. But yesterday, after we finished the show, I went and looked and I saw that Mr. Massey put out a couple tweets trying to explain his view, and he said Adam Schiff acted unethically. But if a resolution to fine him $16 million comes to the floor, I will vote to table it, which means voting against it. In fact, I'm still litigating a federal lawsuit against Pelosi over a salary reduction she imposed on me for my refusal to wear a mask. And the next one, if you can go to it, he continues by saying, the Constitution says the House may make its own rules, but we can't violate other later provisions of the Constitution. A $16 million fine is a violation of the 27th and the 8th Amendments.
Can you imagine what it would be like if this got out of control? So the speaker comes in each morning, okay, A, B, C, D, we have 10 people that just got fined, and this is what you have to pay. Yeah. Oh, I'm not going to write you a check. I would just deduct it from your pay. Yeah. It's not a very good precedent to set. And this whole thing, that was my first question when you
remember you said it.
I said, I don't think I've ever heard of that, especially when I was there. I said, I'll think that through, but it didn't take too long for me to realize that's not solving any problems. Yeah. It's opening up the door to more chaos.
It seemed weird. And one of the commenters and Massey's getting trashed by people because they're just full of emotion. They don't understand that he votes with the Constitution, whether his heart is in favor of censuring or not Adam Schiff. Someone else put this up. I don't know if you think this is relevant, Dr. Paul, but someone pointed out that he believes this is almost like a bill of attainder. You can put that next clip up. This is from Cornell Law School. A bill of attainder is a piece of legislation that declares a party guilty of a crime. Bills of attainder allow the government to punish a party for a perceived crime without going through the trial process. So this other person claims that it's the legislative branch acting as the judicial branch and convicting him of a crime and giving him a fine for it.
And the bill of attainder is usually targeting a person for a political reason.
Yeah.
And that's what that is. They're a very bad precedent. But it's great to have Thomas speaking back to them, because he's going to do it in a dignified and an intellectual manner, and he's going to defend the principles of liberty while doing so.